Let's, just for a moment before we sit down, let's bow our heads. God, grant that your word may be spoken. Grant that your word may be heard. And above all, grant that your word may be lived out in our daily lives through the grace of him who is the living word, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. I always feel the way that most churches are built. When one ends up speaking to a congregation with one's back to the choir, that it says one of two things. Either the choir knows all the theology that was ever invented, or that the choir is now beyond salvation. So that is my way of apologizing to the choir. Now, the clock ticks very quickly, so let's use our few minutes as well as we can. I suspect that most of us know the cartoon character Ziggy. Ziggy is a little person. Ziggy really is all of us, and Ziggy has a little car. And Ziggy does various things in the comic strips as time goes on. But about a year ago, there was a 3-picture strip in which Ziggy was driving along the highway in his little car, and he came to a big notice that said, "Old era ends." And his mouth sort of goes down at the corners. And then he kind of revs up, goes down the highway, and comes across another notice that says, "New era begins." And his mouth sort of goes up at the side. And then he revs up and he goes around a long corner in the highway, and there is a huge notice that says, "Prepare to pay tolls." Prepare to pay tolls. Now, the quiet laughter that we share at that cartoon means that you know what I'm getting at. There isn't a single person in this church who hasn't, because of the vast changes that we're moving through, who hasn't had in recent years to pay tolls of some kind, either personal or relational or professional. All of us know exactly, and behind our laughter, with some of us, there is some pain, because all of us have to pay tolls to get through the end of the 20th century. Now, there are all sorts of ways, and some of us were chatting about this yesterday or the night before. There are all sorts of language which we can use to describe the age that you and I are being asked to move through as the century ends and as we launch out onto a new millennium. For instance, you could use an old word that the Greeks used. Greeks had 2 words for time. If a Greek wanted to say, well, it's 24 minutes past 11, he or she would say chronos. That was the word for time, straight watch time, chronos. But suppose a Greek were going to say something like, it's time that Knox Church did X, or it's time that Canada did Y. They would use a different word. They would use the word kairos, because kairos meant not just that kind of time, but a significant moment. We could use that word. Or we could use a word that comes from the Old Testament. We could use the word wilderness, which is one of the images that goes all through the Bible, because of course it is the geographical context of a great deal of life in the Holy Land. This is a wilderness time. It's interesting that if you sort of listen carefully to the prayer that Susan offered at the end of her chat to the children, she said something about finding answers to the questions of today, or finding answers to the question of our time. But basically that's what you were saying. And in a sense, That is a very natural kind of sentence to say in the 1990s, because one of the marks of a wilderness kairos time is there are far more questions than answers. That's a mark of the 1990s. We have a phrase these days that we often say to each other, that today, in everything, in business life, in law, in the church, in education, in social work, in family life, etc., that basically we are being forced to live the questions rather than come up with easy answers. We are being forced to live the questions. And that's not easy. And all of us find certain tensions in our lives because of having to live questions. The other two words that we could use are, we could use for our time a word that is more a New Testament word. We could say that this is an apocalyptic time. An apocalyptic time. Time of tremendous threat, promise, danger, possibility, breakthrough, impasse. All those contradictory things are true of the end of the 20th century. Or we could use a piece of jargon of our time that's familiar to all of us. We could say that this is a time of paradigm change or paradigm shift. But if all those sort of languages we use, we would be saying the same thing. Now, of all the books in the Bible that expresses a time of immense change, immense turmoil, having to live the questions, immense unpredictability, immense instability, a time of immense transition, the book that does that more than anything else, and that I was saying to some of you, is maybe for us in the late 20th century, next to the Gospels, it may be the most relevant, immediate book that we should study in the Bible. And it's the second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus. Why? Because Exodus is one of the world's great, it may be the world's great story of transition. That's why it's used again and again in every culture. For instance, if you had been a child in school in China at the height of Mao's regime, your teacher would have said to you one day, I want to tell you a story. And it would have been told to children at that time, very much in the circumstances in which Susan told that story of the mothers, as it were, of the centuries. And the teacher would say something like this. She or he would say, children, we were slaves in the cities of southern China. Brackets, Egypt. Chinese teacher wouldn't have said brackets, Egypt. But let us put in brackets to keep us with the story. Teacher would have said, children, we were slaves. Our people were slaves in the cities of southern China to the Kuomintang regime. Brackets, the Egyptians. And a great one came to us named Mao, brackets, Moses, and said, let my people go. And we went. And we escaped. And we went to the banks of a great water, the Yangtze Kiang, brackets, the Red Sea. And it cost us something about 250,000 lives to cross that Red Sea, but the waters opened for us. And we went into the wilderness, brackets, the province, the northern provinces of China. And there we became a great people. And we came to a mountaintop of new discovery, brackets, Sinai. And then we moved back and we took the land that rightfully belonged to us, brackets, promised land. See how it's the same story? Immensely powerful, but as old as there. Same kind of thing. used by Martin Luther King Jr. as he spoke of another quest for freedom in the United States. Same story used in South Africa again and again by people like Desmond Tutu. Always the same story, because it speaks in a time of immense change, transition, risk, discovery, etc. And the reason why it speaks to us so profoundly today is that God is asking you and me, and everybody else who's alive today, to move through a time that may be the area of greatest change, the time of greatest change, maybe for thousands of years. Some of us will remember that towards the end of Bill Moyer's conversations with Joseph Campbell, that series, The Power of Myth, that towards the end, Bill Moyer said to Joseph Campbell, he said, Joseph, do you think that this is one of the ages of greatest change in history? And Campbell grinned and said, no, I don't. And Moyers kind of shot up in his chair because that was out of character with Joseph Campbell. And he said, you don't? And Campbell said, no. He said, Bill, I don't believe that this is one of the ages of greatest change in history. I suspect that it is the age of greatest change in history. Now, strictly speaking, we don't know that yet. We won't know that about the 20th century for maybe another 1,000 years. But it's interesting that a mind like Campbell's is prepared to take the risk of making that hunch. So, that's why I asked that Susan read Exodus this morning. Because Exodus is a tremendous story of transition on every level. Tell you something, one of the really brilliant minds of early Christianity, a person named Origen, was studying Exodus one day in the 3rd or 4th century. And he suddenly got a hunch. And he was the first, as far as we know, to get this hunch. He was studying the book as the story of the Israelites, and he suddenly sat up and said, this is more than the story of the Israelites. This is my own experience. And he was the first to make that sort of great hunch to realize that Exodus is on every level, personal, institutional, political, civilizational, that it is a story that applies at all levels of human life. How does it do that? This way. Exodus says, Egypt is where you are. Egypt is the familiar place. Egypt is where you've been for a while. Egypt is the relationship that has become familiar, the job that has become familiar, the town or the city that has become familiar, the situation that's become familiar. And something appears into our life and says, you can't stay here. You can't stay in Egypt. Now sometimes that is very painful. Suppose, for instance, that your Egypt, that your familiar part of your life is shattered, say by great loss. Maybe loss of professional standing, which has been exceedingly painful for many men and women across our society in the last decade. Or maybe even deeper, loss of somebody, bereavement, somebody who has meant the whole world to you. And suddenly your Egypt is shattered. And in a sense you have to leave it. And there's no choice. And when you leave your Egypt, when you and I leave our Egypts, we really are on the edge of our Red Sea, because that's where we are very vulnerable. After great change, you and I are very vulnerable. And we have to take all sorts of risky decisions. That in the story is our Red Sea, our psychological or spiritual Red Sea. And if we move through those decisions, and if the waters of life and time open for us, and we get across that risky time in our life, we still find ourselves in a wilderness period. Some of you know this, without even my saying it. You find yourself moving through some years that you can only describe as wilderness. Wilderness, where you don't know what's around the next corner, where there is a certain amount of fear, you're not quite sure who you are, there are more questions than answers, there's a lot of instability, etc. That's wilderness. And in the wilderness story, they came to Sinai. In our personal lives, think of Sinai as those times in your life's journey when you get a new sense of direction. When something gives you that way, a new sense of direction. And somehow that life begins again. It may be, who knows, a new relationship, a new job, a new breakthrough. But that can be our Sinais. And then, graced and strengthened by that, we are enabled to move towards the next stage of our life, which in the eternal story is that land that we sought. That land that we sought as a promise to us, that there was a next stage in our lives. Now, of course, human life is such that after you've been in the new land for a while, it becomes Egypt again. And so that's the way we grow. The name of the game for our lives is that our lives are a journey. And you know that as well as I do, so I don't have to nag at it. But you see, that's to interpret that story on a personal basis. But the same thing is true of everything, of every institution. The church today, this congregation, the whole Presbyterian church, all Christians are on a journey through a time of immense unpredictability, turmoil, questions, instability, etc. All of us walk together in a wilderness. And one of the good things about that is that it is making one of us much more than we used to be. Because we need each other in a wilderness time. One of the things you do not do in a wilderness is you do not go through a wilderness on your own. You go through in a caravan. That's why in our lives, support groups are so important. Why the life of an alive congregation is so important. Because that's your caravan through the wilderness of the 1990s. And if you're wise, you will stick with the caravan. Because to go it alone is fatal in a wilderness time. Canada is moving through a wilderness. The Western world is moving through a wilderness. That story of all of us are in Exodus. That's why I say it may be more relevant for our time than any other book. We are in Exodus. Now, let's take that passage that Susan read and let me quickly move through it to sort of focus on a bit of the story to see how it speaks to us. All right. I'm going to read little bits of it, and then, as it were, bring them into the late 20th century. They came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they camped there by the water. Now you see, many of us, by our Bible study, know that every time in the Bible you come across numbers like 12 and 70, that they're far more than numbers. In the Hebrew mind, words like 12 and 70, they didn't mean 12 as distinct from 13 or 11, or 70 as distinct from 69 or 71. They weren't really talking about numbers. They used 12 and 70 as symbols of perfection. So the writer is really saying, they came to Elim, and Elim was terrific. It was terrific. It was beautiful. It was a big turn-on. It was great. Elim was the good times. And they didn't want to leave it. Who does? Because you see, all of us have a memory of Elam. You see, for most people of my generation, Elam is, let's guess, Elam is about 1955. When the kids were small and life was simpler and everything was kind of on the up and up. And that's what we mean by saying, wow, there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. So that's what the Jewish writer is really saying. Elam was the good times. And down deep in many people's hearts of my generation, they want to get back to Elam. But one of the things in the Exodus story is you can never go back. Now, the whole congregation of the Israelites set out from Elam, and Israel came to the wilderness, which is between Elam and Sinai. Bad news. Bad place to be, between Elam and Sinai. Because you see, to be between Elam and Sinai, let's come up to our 20th century, is to be between the good times that we remember, but not yet at the time when we get a new sense of direction. If you're between Elam and Sinai, not good news. Remember the grand old Duke of Wellington had 10,000 men? When they were up, they were up. When they were down, they were down. But when they were neither halfway up, they were neither up nor down. That's where everybody feels in the 1990s. It's where Canada feels, where businesses feel, where churches feel, etc. Neither in a time of tremendous pleasantness and security, which we remember, real or imagined, or at a time when we can see the way clearly ahead. And we are between Elam and Sinai as they were. Now, look at what always happens in societies when they find themselves pitched between Elam and Sinai. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained. Societies in the 1990s, everybody's angry. Ask anybody who deals with the public. Ask any bank teller. Ask anybody who's up front. And they say, what do you hear most from the public? Anger. Anger about tiny things. Anger from the most unlikely people. What do you often hear in church congregation life? Anger. Because that's the nature of a wilderness time. The Israelites complained, and notice who they complain against. Moses and Aaron. In a wilderness time, society always vents its anger on leadership. Whether it be political leadership, business leadership, church leadership, etc. In a wilderness time, everybody gets mad at leaders. Now, notice what the Israelites say. The Israelites said to Moses and Aaron, if only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. Hey, wait a minute. Egypt was prison. Now they're remembering it like a gourmet restaurant. In other words, what do we do in a wilderness time? We romanticize the past. We always do in difficult times. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could go back to, and you choose your time. Egypt remembered all the ball and chain stuff in Egypt, all the lashes, all the cruelty, suddenly sort of is mellowed out by the wonderful works of memory, and here it is, Mother Tucker's dining experience or something like that. As a matter of fact, there is another place in Exodus where they give this routine again to Moses and Aaron, and they list the whole menu that used to be served in Egypt. Dates and figs and pomegranates and whatever. And of course, it was all sort of the deceitfulness of memory. Now, having said that bit of nonsense, they then say something much more dangerous. When a society begins to say this next bit, it's in trouble. They say, you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. We need to listen to that sentence because, you see, it's all right to say to leadership, you're stupid, you're insensitive, you're all sorts of things. Leadership today has pretty well learned to take that sort of stuff. But when we start saying to leadership, you are actually the enemy, then a society is in trouble. And we are doing some of that sort of stuff today. And we need to watch it. That level of alienation between the people, whether it be the people of a church or the people of a country, etc., and leadership, is dangerous stuff. Then the Lord said to Moses, I am going to rain bread from heaven for you. What's God saying? Well, at its simplest and most profound level, God is saying, look, people, there are resources in the wilderness. That's the simple, great piece of good news. You may want to go back to whatever you want to go back to. But God says, you can't, and therefore, will you, for God's sake, listen to me? And let me say to you, that crazy as this time is, tough as these times are, there are resources in the now. There are resources in the 1990s. There are possibilities to life. There are things worth living for now. 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 That's maybe one of the great sentences of this passage. Next thing God says is, each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. That's all. In other words, life in the wilderness, if we're wise, is lived one day at a time. A lot of stuff in a wilderness time like the 1990s, professionally and personally, we have to do a lot of flying by the seat of our pants. Or, if you want it in other language, in a wilderness time, like towards the end of the 20th century, long-range planning has only very limited dividends. That's really what's saying there. You go in a wilderness time, you go and you go out and you gather enough for that day. I'm not saying you don't do long-range planning, that would be stupid. But as soon as we make our long-range plan for the firm or the country or the church, if we're wise, we put it in a drawer. And we start doing the next long-range plan. Because life is like that. Immense transition in a time like this. Then, I'm going to skip down. Moses says a very wise thing at this stage. Things are unpleasant around him, all these feelings. And he says something twice that is very important for all leadership today to realize. He says, at the end of verse 7, says it again at the end of verse 8, he says, what are we that you complain against us? He's standing in front of the people and he says, what are we? His brother Aaron here, and maybe his sister Miriam, because she took immense responsibility, and is saying, what are we that you complain against us? And then at the end of verse 8, he says, your complaining is not against us, but against the Lord. Immensely wise. You realize that long ago man was immensely mature. Because what he's saying is something that anybody in leadership today has to say and has to realize if he or she is going to survive. And that is, Moses is saying to Israel, I refuse to take on responsibility for your anger. I refuse to do that. I refuse to become the focus for your anger. And the ability to realize that is sometimes the ability to which a man or woman today in professional life is going to survive. Is when he or she refuses to carry the neurotic anger of everybody around him or her, and refuses to take that home, and realizes that it may be voiced at him or her, but it's not really about that. Moses says, your complaining is not against us, but against the Lord. Can we put that in late 20th century language? People's anger today is made up of all the fears and anxieties about the time, and it is unfocused anger. It's anger at everything. It's anger at God that says, why didn't you give me an easier time to live in? It's the kind of anger that Hamlet says. Remember from school and college, Hamlet suddenly saying, the times are out of joint. Oh, cursed spite, that ever I was born to set them right. That's the kind of unfocused, neurotic anger that we need to get out of our lives. As a matter of fact, if you look at the second line of Hamlet, there's a great arrogance in that. Notice what Hamlet is saying. The times are out of joint, O cursed spite, that I was ever born to set them right. As soon as Hamlet gets that out of his system, he will be a healthier young man. Because Hamlet wasn't put in the world to set everything right. In fact, if you and I begin to get that idea in professional responsibility, we are in big trouble. I am not here to set the world aright. And if I start trying to, it probably blows me apart because I can't do it. Well, let's move towards the end. Very powerful piece of scripture. Then Moses said to Aaron, say to the whole congregation of the Israelites, actually, let's sort of act it out in a kind of Jewish storyteller way. Moses suddenly realizes that this argument is not getting anywhere. So he turns to Aaron and he says, look, we're not getting anywhere with this row. Get them to go to bed. Just get them all to go to bed. Now, get them up early in the morning, and I want you, don't forget this, I want you to face them to the east. Not to the west, to the east. Got it? Right. Everybody to bed. Why? Why this next passage? Because Moses is sick of seeing something among his people. I don't know how many of you have seen the kind of dark golden glory of sunsets in the southern Sinai. But they are something you remember for the rest of your life because of the dark igneous rock that part of the world is composed of. And with the sort of grayness of the desert shale, the gold of the desert sand, the black of the mountains, that when the sun goes down to the west over distant Egypt, it is deeply moving. It is velvet, it is seductive, it is svelte, it is all of those things. And Moses is fed up of watching Israelites going to the edge of the camp in the evening with all their body language expressing depression, and looking to the west where the sun goes down, and their whole body language saying, gee, I wish I could go back to Egypt. I really wish I could go back. And Moses has had it up to here. And so he says to Aaron, get them up in the morning and you face them to the east. Why? For lots of reasons. Maybe because that's where the sun came up. But one of the great verses of the Bible, and as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the Israelites, they looked toward the wilderness, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. 20th century language. Unless we are prepared to stop saying, if only we could go back to some imagined past, in the church, in our own lives, in Canada, etc. If only we could do that. Until we stop doing that, and until we are prepared to look at the wilderness of our time and say, this is where God has placed us, only then do we have some chance of seeing glory in the wilderness. Only if we are prepared to stand in the present and say, God asks me to live in the 1990s. Not the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 20s, 30s, whatever you choose. And God is not saying, well, why don't you take a great leap back to the future when everything will be wonderful again, like those movies. God says, look, I only give you one zone of time. I give you now. And I want you to be faithful to me now. And I want you to say yes now. And to the degree that you can say yes now, to the degree to which you are being prepared to be faithful to the church as it is now. Because, see, there are all sorts of Christians in Canada saying something like this. Well, I remember a time when the church was really terrific. And I used to be really involved at that time. But since it isn't like that anymore, count me out. And then there are people who are saying, it's another version of this, they say, well, I'm going to wait until the church gets back its senses and comes to its mind again and begins to be, etc. And when that wonderful church of the future comes into being, then phone me. And God says, baloney. God says, come now. Say yes now. Follow now. Follow now. Remember the chap who came to Jesus and said, I think what you say is terrific. I think your stories are wonderful, really like you. You turn me on. Like to follow you. And Jesus says, well, follow me. Guy says, well, wait a minute now. It's Sunday. I got a few things to do. I could be back on Thursday. And Jesus says, don't worry about coming back on Thursday. We won't be here. Come now. Say yes now. In Paul's letters is a wonderful passage where he says, now is the time to awake out of sleep. For now is our salvation nearer. Now, today. That is the time zone of God. Today. Now. And when we make that our time zone, then we have some chance of seeing the glory of God in the crazy present, in spite of its craziness. I think that's why that verse, I think it's verse 10, yeah, that verse 10 is such a wonderful verse. And there's only one last thing, and then we'll end. In the evening, quails came up and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine, flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. And when the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. Now, I've read that in a nice way, but I don't think they said it that way. Because you see, that's not human nature. The Israelites, they didn't say, what is it? They said it in a way that so many Christians, when anything new is presented to them, say. For instance, suppose the church gets a new hymn book, or a new book of worship, or there's a certain kind of new music played by the choir, or something. What do we say? We say, ooh, what is it? That's the way they said that in the desert. What is it? And Moses didn't say nicely, as we would read it in church, it is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. Tra-la-la. Moses was Jewish. And I think Moses said it like this. He said, think of him as gritted teeth, all right? Think of him as Charlton Heston, gritted teeth. And Moses says, so you don't know what it is? So you want to know what it is? So you want me to tell you what it is? So I'll tell you what it is. And then, biting out every word, he says, it is the bread which God has given you to eat today. And since there isn't anything else to eat, as far as I know, in a circle of 500 miles radius from here, I suggest that you eat it. And I think that that's what God is saying to us today. God is saying, I give you resources for the 1990s. I give you worship. I give you bread and wine. I give you the water of baptism. I give you the church as it is, with all its problems, etc. Now don't say, Ugh. What is it? But eat it. Eat it and drink my grace, and then you will be able to continue the journey. Personally, professionally, as a country, as a church, then the journey will go on. Now, I shared those things because, as I said, I think that that book is immensely important to us today, and I think that that chapter is immensely relevant to our time. And may I say what an immense pleasure it has been to worship with an obviously very alive congregation. I have said these things to you in the name of the risen one, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.